It's ad break time. I'm pleased to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast remains proudly sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. This week I have a very special announcement, which is that I will once again be teaching a class for their certificate in applied game design. Come take Using Games to Teach What You Can Convey Through Play with yours truly. The class runs from January 22nd to February 29th, and I would love to see you there. A link to the registration page is in the show notes. CLGS's latest game, 500-Year-Old Vampire, just finished a very successful campaign, but if you forgot to back it, you can now pre-order through BackerKit. The link is also in the show notes. I also want to plug my own Patreon. Your support means a lot to me, both emotionally and financially. Patreon money is what makes it possible to keep improving my channel by upgrading the equipment, and I'm also hoping to increase the amount of videos I can publish over the course of the next year. If you want to help out, head over to patreon.com/BeyondSolitaire. For now, though, let's get on with the show. Hey gamers, it's Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and this week on the podcast, I have a very special guest. This is Josh Sawyer. He is the studio design director for Obsidian Entertainment, and I'm very excited to have him on. How you doing, Josh?
Doing very well. Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate you taking the time. So I have had you on the show because I played and absolutely loved Pentiment this year,
Thank you.
and I wanted to talk to you about it. So I know you've probably had this interview many times before, but just for people who are not totally sure what Pentiment is, can we give them just a quick rundown?
Pentiment is a narrative adventure game, sort of a story game set in 16th century Holy Roman Empire, specifically in Upper Bavaria, at the fictional Kearsau Abbey, which is a Benedictine abbey, and the nearby town of Tassing. You play a character named Andreas Mahler, who is a journeyman artist. He is finishing his Wanderjahre and returning to Nuremberg, his hometown, where he hopes to become a master. And he's basically just doing odd jobs in one of the last monastic scriptoria really in existence. And when a murder happens and he gets entangled in it, and then he winds up trying to solve that murder and a series of other murders that take place in the community over the span of about 25 years.
Fantastic. So just for people who are listening, I do want to warn y'all, there will be light spoilers for the early part of this podcast. If you want to go into this game, it sounds good to you, and you don't want to know anything about it, just stop. Come back later. I'll be here. But if you want to listen on, by all means, because I'm super excited to have this conversation. So I guess I kind of want to start with, so this game is a murder mystery on the front of it, but it's really a game that's very much about, I think, layering history on top of history. And one thing I'm just going to say up front is that the murder mysteries are not satisfying in the traditional sense of a murder mystery. You do not actually find out who did the murder. When did you come to the conclusion that you were going to plot the game that way? Did it start out as a normal murder mystery, or did the murders become an object of interest later?
No, I knew it was going to be a murder mystery, but I also knew that I wanted the player to not know definitively who the murderer was. And I wanted on our side, in sort of constructing this list of suspects, it's okay if there are some suspects that seem more likely, as long as it's not definitive. We're never definitive with the player. We wanted the player to have to deal with the difficulty of not knowing and the difficulty of ambiguity, and having, in many regards, very minimal evidence with which to sort of like figure out who the most likely killer is, or who the person you're okay with basically being killed for the murder is. And that was a sort of central concept right away. And it kind of grew out of looking at other murder mystery games and saying, there's not much difficulty to sit with. And in role-playing games, I think the ones that people like from Obsidian, the ones that people respond well to, are the ones that make them make very difficult decisions. And the decisions are not very difficult if you get told canonically whether they're right or wrong. They're difficult because they're ambiguous and there are trade-offs, and you kind of have to live with that. So that was really a core concept of the the game and the story.
What kind of feedback have you gotten from players about that? Are there people who feel truly agonized about the choices that they've made throughout the game?
Oh, absolutely. Some feel agonized. Some really just don't like the concept. I've seen a few people that say, "I don't like this. I don't want to I don't want to play a murder mystery where I can't figure out if I made the right choice." And that's okay. Um, I try to be pretty upfront about how it's going to go. Other people kind of stumble into it, and it is really agonizing, and they feel in a lot of ways that they're messing up all the time, that they're making the wrong decision. Also, the way that our conversation checks work, it's very easy to fail most of your conversation checks. And so people feel like, oh man, like there wasn't enough time and I couldn't talk to everyone. And I don't really, and I failed these checks and maybe I could have known more. And this person wound up dying. And even if they're the person that I thought should die, I still feel very bad about how this went down. So, which is all intentional. That's how it's supposed to feel. So, yes, I have seen a lot of players feel appropriately. They get the experience that I intended them to have.
I guess just a clear feeling question as we're kind of warming up is also, I personally felt so there are people of different economic strata in this game. So you have people, the Abbey, who have money for now. The business is dying because the illuminated manuscript business is fading. You have people in town who are essentially peasants, and you have people in town who are sort of tradespeople and who have more cash to work with. But you spend the game, you investigate or you get to know people by going to them and having lunch that they provide for you. So is that something that, how did you decide to build that aspect into the game? How realistic is that? And did have other people express sort of like, "Ooh, am I imposing on these people?" feeling? Is that culturally accurate? I just kind of want to know.
Yeah, I actually don't know if it's accurate at all, especially not to the magnitude where Andreas is constantly dropping in on people. Um, I don't think there's any evidence that everyone in the town would at every meal take in this wandering artist. But it was important structurally to pace out the investigation. And it was also important narratively for you to get a sense of all the people that live in these places or are visiting, and what separates them and what brings them together, things that are commonly experienced around the meal table, and things that are really separated a lot by social status. And so that became a central thing because if the game were just a series of investigation, 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 you would miss out on all these social interactions. You would miss out on all this visibility into how people lived and ate. And some of these meals are really difficult to get through. Like, some of the families are sometimes they're dysfunctional in a sort of funny way. Sometimes they're dysfunctional in a really, truly unpleasant way. And sometimes they're quite lovely. Um, and some people aren't, there are the bachelors in town in the second act who kind of, they eat meals together. There's also sort of the more or less outcasts like the charcoal burner and the Romani tinker and the executioner, who are all essentially in the same sort of off to the side social class, and how they eat together and talk together. So I just wanted to give that perspective, and I think it's probably one of the most successful sort of new elements that we added into the format of the game.
Nice. And I think one of the things that those lunches shows off is, I would say, the diversity of the characters, the different ways they live, the different kinds of people they are, which actually kind of leads into one of the things that really impressed me about this game and excited me. I was particularly excited about Brother Sebhat because he's an Ethiopian Christian. I wrote my dissertation about Coptic monks in the 4th and 5th centuries. So, to me, seeing him and seeing the Ethiopian art in his Bible was stunning. I was really excited. But you
Awesome.
also have the Tinker, who is a total heretic. I was stunned by some of the stuff he was saying. Like, that's me. Right? I've studied a lot of heresies. And then you also have a representation of a Jewish family,
Yeah.
the Sommerfelds.
Yep.
And so, was that a diversity that was built in from the ground up? Or did you just want to represent people that you found along the way through research?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is when you're portraying history, you're choosing what history you portray. There's a lot of, I've seen a lot of kind of dismissals about diversity where people will say, well, that's just how it was. And it's like, come on, man. Like that's not strictly true. And even if, people from, you know, especially someplace like Ethiopia are certainly not common, you're telling a story. And one thing that I liked about Umberto Eco's novel, The Name of the Rose, and also the film adaptation of it, is that they're like, yeah, here are people from far away, like all over the place. And yes, that includes a black translator. Um, and it's just like nobody really comments on it. They're like, yep, he is here in the Abbey doing work like everybody else. Because there are people from all over Europe there as well. So basically, in making a fictional place, I get to decide what is in this fictional place. And Kearsarge is really a mix. I'm very sad that the post is down, but there was a person who lives in Upper Bavaria, who thought that Tassing and Kearsarge seemed like they might be real. They're not, they're fictional, but then they piece together what the individual inspirations were, because they are inspired by individual elements from lots of communities in Upper Bavaria and lots of monastic communities in Upper Bavaria. But in making this fiction, I get to decide who is there when and who populates it. And as long as it is within the realm of possibility, even if it isn't probable, and I think that it makes the story more interesting, then I can do that. So, I can have Sebhat, who is returning a favor from the Council of Constance, which we have documented records of Ethiopians being present at a century earlier. And so the story he presents of being given a beautiful Bible, which was then taken back to Ethiopia, and then he's repaying that favor. Yes, that is completely fabricated. It is also a thing that could have happened. So here it is. And, Sebhat, or not Sebhat, but Václav is, a character in isolation. It's not like I'm an expert on Romani culture, but I thought having this individual Romani character who is both a tinker and also very unique in his beliefs, which are, sort of develop and grow in odd ways over time, I thought would be very interesting. And then, yes, the Sommerfelds. So we have the Sommerfelds as Jewish printers in Prague. Prague had ups and downs with Jews, but undoubtedly Jews were extremely present in Prague for a long time, and they were print, like a lot of Jewish printers were in Prague, and so I wanted to represent them not only culturally, but also say like they were also engaged in some of the same trades that the characters that are central to the story are engaged in, focused on a different audience. So, being able to develop, pioneer like new typefaces that are specifically for a Jewish audience. That is a thing that they would do, and in fact, we're doing in this time period.
That's fantastic. So the other thing that I kind of had a question about then in relation to that is, so you have a lot of creative license to create this world, and some parts of the story are kind of, I don't want to say on rails. They're things that you're definitely going to encounter as you pass through like the main quest, as it were. So, for example, the scene where you're collecting books for Sister Illuminata, you get the Aeneid, which I was very happy with as a lad teacher. You get the Mirror of Simple Souls, which is like a crazy, like mystical text, and then you get Wretched Garen, which is like an adventure text.
Yep.
How did you choose? I guess which things that were really cool to put in places where the player was definitely going to stumble on them versus maybe a little bit off the beaten path. So like you can completely miss the absolutely fantastic Sebhat scene with the gorgeous, Ethiopian Bible
Yeah.
illustrations if you don't have lunch with him.
Yeah, I mean it's a balancing act, because sometimes you want to say like, well, the player can't miss this, but that's part of the joy of having your own personal story. So with Illuminata's book hunt, that was actually one of the first special scenes that we did, basically. And it didn't change a whole lot past the prototype implementation of it. We added a few more details here and there, but I thought about, I wanted to have, something like the Aeneid, which was present for such a long period of time and was referenced for such a long period of time, still being present. But even at that time, the version that you're talking about is like quite old by that time, and like obviously the story is even older than that. And she says that Piero was copying it. He was supposed to actually be making a new copy of the Aeneid. but then also having Mirror of Simple Souls, which was in very limited circulation. There are, not many. I don't even know if at this point if there are any extant copies of period, uh, you know texts of it, and so that creation is essentially a fiction. But yeah, they're all burned. So at this point in time, we're saying, well, here's one that maybe escaped the flames, depending on what you do. And then Richard Guerin, like this is it's a print book, but it was also illustrated and it was held in high regard and it was valuable. So I wanted to represent all of those things. But then you're right. There are things like Brother Sebhot. Now, I did place Brother Sebhot in a place where it's very, very, very likely that a player is going to encounter him. They're very likely to talk to him. Um, there was some concern on the team that players would miss him. And I said, that's their choice. He's always there. He always hangs out near the cloister. He doesn't have the same responsibilities as the other brothers, so he's basically doing sacred reading, um, all the time, and he's hanging out by the cloister. So we just conveniently put him there to remind you he's there, and if you miss it, then you miss it, and that's true of a lot of stuff. Like in Act Two, you can also miss the entire Golden Hand sequence, which is easily the most expensive sequence in the game, but you can not do it if you choose to not do it, and that's okay. That's your choice.
Fair enough. And so back to the Aeneid. Whose interpretation of the Aeneid is coming out of Sister Illuminata's mouth?
I'm sorry, in what sense?
So, because she doesn't like the poem,
Yeah.
she has a lot to say about women,
Yes.
and how they are kind of forced into plot lines that aren't really theirs. They don't get to be the hero of their own story. They don't
Mhm.
have enough agency. And I love the blocking of that particular scene where she actually, like, steps into the same space as burning Dido.
Yeah.
It's really, really nice. Um, but why did you decide to play Sister Illuminata that way? And what interpretations did you use? Is it thoroughly modern, or do you have some sort of historical basis for that?
I guess the historical basis is so Illuminata from the beginning was conceived to be an extremely intelligent and very well read woman. She's from a noble family. These are details you can find out. I mean, unsurprisingly, all of the officers of the abbey are from rich backgrounds. And in fact, her family and just like Sisters Zedena's and also Mother Cecilia's donate an enormous amount of money to the abbey. Not uncommon. But because of her wealth and her background, and her intelligence, she's very well read. She very easily could have read, and you can bring up Christine de Pizan. So, it wasn't that what we would think of strictly as feminist thought existed in this point in time, but certainly there was not only individual awareness, but also literally published texts about women and the roles of women. And also, it's worth remembering that Christine de Pizan was writing effectively a defense of women because the Romance of the Rose was so misogynistic. And even if you read something like the Decameron by Boccaccio, who was considered to be a feminist, proto feminist of his day, it's extremely misogynistic. Like in the early pages of the Decameron, the women are saying we being women and being very dumb and having tiny dumb brains need to find men to take care of us. And so there's obviously like a very strong current of certainly they wouldn't think of it as being misogynistic, but like not super favorable to women. But there were rare voices. But rare as they were, Christine de Pizan was published. She was known. And to someone like Illuminata, who's very intelligent, well read, she would be aware of that. And I think that she would be capable of forming thoughts about it on her own. And would she have used exactly the language that she used in that time period? Questionable. As with many things that are related to sort of class and gender in this time period. But I do think that not having her talk about it misses out on the fact that there were voices talking about this thing in this time period, even if they were extremely rare and not well known outside of extremely elite, educated circles.
Nice. And I also liked though that you use the need as well to kind of, I guess, talk about things that Piero wanted. or dreamed about. And the same thing with Wretched Garen. What kinds of attitudes did you want to kind of give to the monks to make them maybe a little more human, sometimes a little less holy?
Yeah.
Um, what kinds of choices went into depicting them, I guess, as real monks, humanity and holiness?
Yes. So I wanted one of the reasons why the cast is so big is because I didn't want anyone to kind of be a monolith. Like we have Sister Illuminata, but we also have Sister Zedena, and they are very, very different people, even though they're quite almost literally in the same role and from very similar backgrounds. But one takes her role, even if she kind of has opinions about it, she takes it very seriously, and she's quite pious, even if she's a little bit of a let's say a gossip. But she definitely regards her vocation very seriously. And the other is not into it at all. But then and Guy and with Piero and Guy and Addoc, we have three monks in the scriptorium, and Piero and Addoc are, I would say, quite pious, and Guy is not super pious, and they kind of reflect their interests. So Piero he likes the Aeneid, and you don't get his opinion on it, but he does have a sense of duty and responsibility, and there's obviously a lot of those themes within the Aeneid. When you look at Attic, it's kind of funny to think of him being interested in adventure stories, but that is the book that he was reading, and they're still entertaining. And so the idea that this old Cornish monk, very far from home, finds this so entertaining. And then with Guy, it's a little more about, and this is kind of hinting at his interest later on, is he likes reading forbidden things. He likes knowing things that he's not supposed to know. And even though it's a very different tone from the text that he's associated with in Act Two, the idea that because it talks about how he's hiding it. I think Andreas can say, yeah, Guy seems kind of secretive about that book because he knows that it's heretical. He knows that it's not supposed to be read. And also he's Burgundian. And so he can read the text. And what exactly his interests are, who knows? But you can kind of speculate based on these guys that there are other interior aspects to them that you're not quite as familiar with and just talking to them.
Yes. And so this also kind of leads me to one of the characters I thought was the most interesting, which made me happy because I got to play her. Is so you're Andreas for significant portions of the game. There is a portion where you're not playing as him. You're playing as Magdalene,
Mm-hmm.
who is a woman who is a printer. So what kind of gave you inspiration to have the characters to have players, embody a female character, and why her with her specific characteristics?
Yeah, I thought that having you always be in the role of Andreas was limiting in perspective. And obviously, like any character has limitations on how they're perceived and people perceive them, or yeah, how they perceive others and how people perceive them, and where they can go and where they can't go. And I did think, hey, it would be interesting to switch that and have someone who is maybe adjacent socially, but a woman, and seeing like, especially a young woman, and seeing how differently they're sort of treated and talked to within this time period. Arguably, it would have been even worse than it is as portrayed, but um, at least giving you a sense of, oh wow, this is like very different and a little condescending and kind of frustrating. And she does have, backgrounds, but those backgrounds are not the same as the ones that Andreas gets to pick from because she can't go to a university. I mean, granted, most people couldn't go to a university, and even Andreas only went through exceptional circumstances, but it certainly was not a place that women in this time period went. So she does have backgrounds based on her reading, but also her role in the community, and those are social and those are domestic, and that does restrict her in ways that Andreas is not restricted. And so allowing the player to make those choices and play in that role, yeah, it was really to give a sense of she kind of is similar in some ways, and she does have standing and can stand up for herself, but it's not really the same. And she does constantly have to fight against people second guessing her, and the fact that she doesn't quite have the background. Like, even if you have the polyglot background, for example, her Latin is never going to be as good as Andreas's Latin, having gotten a university education, if he so chose to do that. And that's frustrating. That's intentionally frustrating. Like, if you get Historia Tassii, you can go like, I just want to read this thing. And if you know some Latin, you're like, well, I know some of this, but I need someone's help, and no one will help you. And that's supposed to feel frustrating. And that frustration is coming from the fact that you just don't have the access that other people would.
Yeah, in a way, I felt like people, because she is from the town, I felt like people told me more and felt more intimate with me, but also respected me less when I was playing with
Yes.
her.
Yes. And a lot of that respect, or that lack of respect, is coming from men, mostly older men, but all the men. Um, and yeah, there's from the young men, it's a combination of teasing, or it's like kind of wrapped in teasing. Uh, but they're really not respectful towards her. I mean, Utz is probably the best example, where she continually has the opportunity to remind him, please do not call me by this nickname. And he just keeps doing it, and he brushes it off. He's like, "Hey, what's the problem?" And it's like, "Dude, you're like really being disrespectful doing this constantly." But that's not a uncommon experience to have guys do that, especially wrapping it into this idea of like, I'm just joking around, I'm just playing around. Like, oh man.
Yeah, I mean, so out of work, I'm just Liz, but at work, the number of times I get called Ms. Davidson instead of Dr. Davidson is ungodly.
Yeah. And I,
So
I, I will
I felt
say,
that.
for most of Act 3, I gave feedback on it, but we stubbed the dialogues together as sort of like a group of writers. But I had Zoe Franznik, who was our associate writer on the project. I had her write most of Magdalena's responses and structure a lot of that, because I'm I'm a 48-year-old man. Like, I have some idea of how these conversations would go, but she has much more direct and immediate experience, as a woman in her 20s. So I tried to use her to, and I told her, like, I want you to kind of, I don't want her voice to be like Andreas's voice. That's not the point. Otherwise, like, why switch the character? So, we went back and forth on a lot of those lines and how the conversations went. But yeah, the approach was really for it to feel like this is a new character. This is a different character, and her experiences are, and her way of responding is very different.
Indeed. So I want to go back to Piero. He was so sweet. I think Andreas maybe likes him better than his real dad, based on the growing up with him. But he's kind of a throwback as a character. But he's also so very accepting. Like, in some ways, I actually wonder if you had not done the first murder investigation, would Piero actually have been happier? But he seems to accept that the future is coming, that his life as he's known it in the scriptorium is ending, and this is sort of the last general question I ask before we move too deep into spoiler territory, I think, about the overall plot of the game. But I will say others in this game do not have like a similarly chill relationship with time passing and people, having whatever relationship they're going to have with what came before. So why did you design Piero that way? And also, like, you have worked in video games for a long time. Do you have anything that you're nostalgic about as time passes? I mean, your field has changed probably very significantly over the course of
Yeah.
your career.
Yeah. I think it was important for one character very close to Andreas to essentially have a fully chill, um, essentially to say, like, things are changing and that's okay. Like, we are actually in the early modern period. Like, we don't know that yet, but that's where we are. And so there are a lot of people that are upset about a lot of things. And Piero was quite old at the beginning of the story, and he's a very, and also, I think it worked to have the guy being accused of the murder just be the nicest guy you could ever possibly meet. Um, and not very really objectionable in any way. He's just a very, very sweet man, and he says, the way he looks at it is he has this very almost scholastic look at it, which is like, yes, this is moving out of the hands of the church, or it's moving out of the hands of the monasteries. And you can bring up like, yeah, anybody can write anything. Don't you think there's danger to that? And he's like, sure, but like truth is still truth. And like if we're gonna get Aquinas-y about this, eventually, if you keep searching, you will find the truth. Even through all of the missteps along the way, the truth is still there. So he's kind of like, it's going to be okay. Like, it's all right. Like time's rolling on. It's going to be okay. Just remember that. And so having him be that kind of like voice saying, it's all right. Like the future is coming and there are going to be problems, but it's going to be okay was important. And now I think I forgot the second part of your question.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll just follow up. So, is that something that you believe, or is it something that you tell yourself? Like, do you feel nostalgic or stressed about changes in gaming, about the passage of time?
Oh, I mean, I feel a lot of stress about the state of the world right now. Um, but then again, the perspective of Piero as a true believer in the soteriology of his faith, um, it's the passage of time is only bringing us closer to good news. Good things are going to happen in the end. Like we might go through difficulty, but at the end of it is redemption. So it's going to be cool. I'm a little more stressed about the day to day and the year to year. Um, Less about gaming itself. I think gaming is fine. I mean, we're all caught up in the same system, which is, I mean, this has been a good year for gamers and a bad year for the games industry. Like there have been incredible games that have come out, and there have been over 6,000 layoffs within the industry globally, and that is rough. And I would say that aspect is not cool or good. I do. It's mixed feelings about the game market as well, where it's easier than ever for small teams to get their game out and into the world. Like it's easier to make games, it's easier to distribute games. Digital distribution makes that easier than ever. Like that would have been impossible when I got in the games industry, unthinkable. But there are so many games coming out now that it is very hard to stand out, and it's very hard for small developers to get their games seen, which is really, really rough. And I don't know if there's an easy solution to that. So, I think it's nice looking at the games landscape where I can make, I, I would not have been able to make a game like Pentiment at any point in my career prior to when I made it, which is crazy because it's in some ways such a simple game. But it's because I'm part of, or because Obsidian is part of Xbox. Xbox has Game Pass. Game Pass is oriented around unique experiences. And so yeah, lucky me. But there are downsides to the march of time when it comes to the games industry.
So, one more thing about Pierre, I feel like he's sort of the conscience of the game in a way. He also gives Andreas what I think probably is the best advice that anybody gives anybody in that game, which is he looks at Andreas's masterpiece in progress and says, "Why are you doing it without putting yourself and what you see in this image?" And I feel like that is a really important thing I think to say about art. But it also made me wonder, where do you most see yourself in Pentiment?
The whole game. No, I draw inspiration from a lot of different places. One of the inspirations, although it might not seem like it immediately, was Sunday in the Park with George by Stephen Sondheim. I'm really inspired by Sondheim as just a creative person, as a writer, and the way that he views mentorship and doing art. And I think that it was very interesting seeing Sondheim make a musical about the experiences of an artist, a visual artist, but really in a lot of ways it was about his experiences as a creative artist working in musicals. And so the story of Pentiment is about Andreas's struggles with being a visual artist. And those are inspired by my own struggles working in a medium that is commercial, but also artistic. Also, my father is a sculptor, and that's a rough gig at times. So, observing him and his experiences as an artist and struggling to feel like you can really say anything new or interesting or that something that's going to engage people, and that constant wrestling with the desire to express yourself and express ideas and opinions while still being something that is a commercial product, which is very difficult. Um, And yeah, I do think ultimately with Andreas as a young man, he's just thinking of from the perspective of I get to make art. I can do the craft that my father and my brothers do, and it's good enough to accept that I have a job, right? Like I went to university and I failed out and this is my last chance, so I have to make this work. And his father is kind of saying like, "Hey, you're not going to drop out again, or like you're not going to quit this like you quit university, right?" He's like, "No, no, no, no. Like I'm doing art. It's okay." And so his perspective in the first act is very yeah, like I need to make my masterpiece. This is a good source to pull from. And it's worth saying that Piero's way of looking at art is so modern. It's so not period appropriate. It's like way beyond what people in this time period would think of about this stuff. Um, but again, like I am trying to say something to the audience about the act of making art in any medium, the act of expressing yourself in any medium. And Piero saying, like, you're copying this thing that is supposed to represent the world, but this isn't what the world is anymore. Like, you're essentially, like perpetuating a falsehood about the way that the world works in doing this, and you need to be aware of that. So yeah, he is the conscience. In many ways, I don't know how familiar you are with the Cadfael series,
Oh yeah.
but Cadfael is like the most, especially in the series with Derek Jacobi, the most progressive monk in history, right here. Um, but that's not a bad thing. So having Piero be this sort of like forward-looking, very wholesome guy was a very intentional choice.
I like it. All right, so this leads to my next question, but I'm just going to put in here for people listening. Spoiler alert! Spoiler alert! If you do not want full like plot discussion of this game, go away. I love you though. Come back after you played it. All right. So this is what I want to ask you. So you had something to say to people about art and the making of art, but I also think that you had a lot to say to players about how do we treat history. And so, as you play the game, like it's very clear that, this town is built on Roman ruins. There's some sort of relationship with the ancient past. But how did the fictional ancient past of Tassing come into play for you? And at what point did you know that you wanted to have a game that really spanned that much time and was interacting with its impact on the the town as it was in the game?
I knew that I wanted it to take place over about 20, 25 years pretty early on. I think I settled on 25 years within a few months of us starting development. Um, I also really wanted to deal with, uh, I knew I wanted to deal with Roman history because there are so many German settlements that are at their foundation Roman colonies. And then I thought, well, we could go even farther back. We could go back into pre Roman, um, essentially, Celt in some in form, pagan people who lived in these places and moved around and either were routed or came back in various time periods. And so then, that idea of a secret history that was not known to people, but that was somehow represented here and there, and that you could see traces of it in plain sight, but you would never have the clear picture of it. That became more and more important, especially with the name of the rose being such an inspiration, and so much of this sort of like hidden or lost history being a sort of not a sort of central theme, the central theme of the name of the rose. I just thought it would be interesting to explore how history is these bits and pieces and remnants, and the story that gets passed on, or these stories that get passed on, reshaped and reframed by different people at different times in different languages, in different representations. And yeah, that developed more organically over the course of developing the full story.
So, how do you see the relationship between, I guess, the recent history of the town? So, like, you have, I mean, you allow players to have their own version of this, right? In the mural in the rat house at the end of the game. But what did you want to communicate, I suppose, about things like the uprising of the villagers and Otto's death and the mercenaries coming in? How did that connect for you? Because it clearly connects in the mural in the game with that earlier history, and how did you want players to kind of read that?
I think when when you have choices about how to portray the Roman history or like the Christian history, the pagan history, these are things where you're kind of like, I don't know. Like who can say? Who can say really what's going on here? And you can kind of be a little like well, none of us were there. So I guess I can kind of make a choice, and you still have to explain it. Like, Utz will ask you, Werner will ask you, like, why are you making these choices? And you have to justify those. But you can kind of say, like, we weren't there for any of this. So we can kind of talk about and know these things. But then I got to pick one thing. And that one thing is, I think, true-ish, true in spirit, true in idea, true in some symbolic value. And that's one thing. But the revolt, like you, the player, you played through that. And technically, Magdalena lived through it, even though she was too young to remember exactly what happened. And Klaus says directly to her, like, people think that history is this thing that happens to other people, but we were here. Like, we lived through this. We saw what happened. And he really feels, he has survivor's guilt. Like, he really feels like, I am guilty of having survived when other people died. I didn't stop this. And so the least that I can do is make sure that people remember actually what happened, because we were all here, and before we're gone, I need to put this down. And I'm an artist, so I'm going to put it down in art. And so it's to let the player know, like, these other things, someone, like, all the ways that you found out about this stuff that have been passed down, now you are an active part in telling the history of your own community in living memory. And it's to say, like, this is the same thing. Like, we're always doing this. We're always constantly engaged actively in this process, whether it's verbally or what we write or what the art that we make, the films that we make, whether those things are documentaries or they're, elaborate fictions to convey some sort of artistic truth. This is the process that we're all engaged in. It's not a thing that happened in the past that we're now separated from. The end of history is not real. We're still in it.
So as with people who like to tell the truth about history and the and want to lay it out, you're also going to get that pushback, the pushback of people who would like to sanitize the past, possibly erase it entirely. I feel like I can assume your opinions on that, given that the people who are doing the pushback tend to be the bad guys in Pentiment. But what kind of led to Father Thomas being like the ultimate evil mastermind of the game?
So the thing is, I think it's important, although there is an act that separates it, Act 2 to Act 3, where Thomas explains his trauma, really his trauma and Sister Amelie's trauma, which came from basically someone using the Malleus Maleficarum to incite a riot that burned down Sister Amelie's convent, of which she is the only survivor. And that experience, more so than just being religious, because there are tons of very devout religious characters that are not doing extreme things in the story, but Thomas specifically had a traumatic experience. Amelie had a traumatic experience, and that trauma caused Father Thomas to develop an extremely severe attitude toward people agitating about the past and about truth and things like that. And he was like, no, 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 no. Like, I'm not going to allow that to happen again. We need stability. We need, like, basically, people do not need to get riled up about this stuff, because if they get riled up about it, then there's going to be more death. There's going to be like, and, seeing the German peasant uprising, he's like, like, because by the time that Act 2 is occurring, there have already been widespread killings. I mean, I think the sack of Kempton Abbey had already occurred. That's not that far away. That's quite close. And I mean, those monks were killed. I mean, they burned that place down. So Thomas is like, no, 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 no. Like, we got to calm down. Like, I have seen literally firsthand what happens, and it is happening around us, and it's not going to happen here. And so he's, and I can't remember what the term is, but it's sin by degrees, right? Like, it starts off simply, and then it gets more complicated, and then it gets like worse and worse and worse. And yeah, at the end, he's like, yeah, I thought I was doing the right thing. Like, I tried to prevent more bad things from happening, but that isn't what happened. Like, just worse things, worse and worse things happened, which, it's not the exact same attitude that, for example, the antagonist in The Name of the Rose had, and I don't want to spoil that book, but you can see similar thought patterns of, I think that this knowledge is going to cause a lot of problems, and it's ultimately like, it's just not worth it. And it also isn't, he's basically like, this is a fiction that I think can be preserved because it's not a fiction about the underlying faith, the faith in Christ, the faith in redemption. It's about other figures, and it's okay. And so he just makes this series of wild decisions to preserve that. And yeah, it's just, he's too traumatized, and he makes a bunch of really bad decisions.
I'm actually really glad we had this conversation because the first time I played through that game and got to that scene, I really saw what he was doing as inherently selfish of like, I want to preserve my position as somebody who is the keeper of this important church and this important story. And if we don't have these pilgrims, we're all screwed. I think I read what he was doing as still trying to preserve something, but in a more selfish way. It's really
Mhm.
interesting to kind of read what he's doing also through that lens of trauma.
Yeah.
But what made you decide to make the church basement a Mithraeum?
So it's actually because I went to Cologne. And everybody, well, I shouldn't say everybody, lots of people know about the Kölner Dom, the Cologne Cathedral, which is incredible and beautiful and not actually medieval. They stopped building it in the 19th century, but that is an incredible edifice. But on the that side of the Rhine, a little farther down and a little further away from the river, is what is now an evangelical church, I believe, evangelical Lutheran church, and it is built directly on top of Roman tombs. Um, and it is not uncommon for things to be literally built on foundations of Roman stuff. And so I thought that there was an interesting mirroring of, because they did it right. Like, this happened all the time. And so having the Christian church be built on top of the Mithraeum, um, is not wholly inconceivable. And again, I don't know if we actually have examples of churches directly on top of a Mithraeum, but we certainly have examples of them built on other temples.
Certainly, and
Um,
out of other temples, actually.
yes, and out of
Yeah,
other temples, like, no problem. So the idea of them, and Mithraea were, they were always subterranean, like, inherently. That's part of the deal. They're subterranean. So the idea of, here's Mithraeum, and then here's the church, Our Lady of the Labyrinth, built above. And you hear the story of Our Lady of the Labyrinth from Thomas, and it's a story, and it's a myth, and like, he's the only source that you have for it. But you also do have this icon and the labyrinth. And when you go into the Mithraeum, on the floor is the labyrinth. So, like, how are these connected? How were these connected? They're literally right on top of each other. Somebody at some point, you know that somebody visually connected these things, but that's lost.
yeah.
Like, was it a sign? Was it a vision? Was it literally a copy? Was it copied somewhere else and then it was carried over to the church? You don't know. All you know is that this is built directly on top of each other, and that this symbol is here and it's carried above. There was another historian who actually did a breakdown and was like, incredulous about the representations of other Roman gods within the Mithraeum. But we have examples, I believe, actually now a Hungarian guy did a really deep dive into Pentiment, and he gave me an example of a Hungarian Mithraeum where on the flanks, the left and right flanks leading to the altar, are all altars to other gods. Um, and that's the thing, is that Mithras was not a god that was viewed in isolation or as a monotheistic, like he coexisted with. And if you watch Justin Sledge's incredible breakdown of the Mithraic liturgy, he talks about how the liturgy talks about transcending the Roman gods. Not that they don't exist, but saying we're even better. Like, you've heard of Mars? Check out Mithras. Like, he's even cooler. So the incorporation of those deities, even if I have committed maybe not many historical sins, but certainly more or archaeological sins. But they were in the pursuit of this greater truth, let's say.
Well, also, I was really happy to see the Mithraeum because she picks up. She's like, "What's a Mithraeum?" Like, Magdalena's like, reading, and like, "There's gonna be a Mithraeum. There's gonna be where, when is the Mithraeum gonna happen?" And then it happened. I was so happy, and then I was like, "Fuck, Father Thomas." Oh, it was crushing. Um, so, so I want to kind of connect. So in a way, this game is very much about history and accepting what really happened and being, honest with what used to be there and what we're on top of. But this is also a game I think about moving on from the past. It's about second chances. Andreas is very messed up about some things that have happened in his life. In Act 2, he's super messed up in Act 3 because of the loss of Casper. He somehow manages to move on, and Thomas, I think, is so tortured by the past that he can't. So, how did you want to, I guess, connect that historical undertone with also an acceptance of the past to move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this idea of moving forward is not, we have to throw everything away. I mean, even Piero doesn't say that. He's like, these things are all still going to be here, maybe, hopefully, in a couple of 100 years. Who knows what they'll say about what we put down and who we were and what we were trying to say. Um, but there's also, I think it's important to remember that uh, obviously these were Christian people. And that fundamental in their understanding of life, like both physical life and spiritual life, is the ability to start over and to live again. And that comes across. Thomas is very stuck, and Thomas is obviously very afraid. And it's one could say that he doesn't really have the faith that he professes, if he's so draconian about this. But actually, right before Magdalena goes home on Christmas Eve, when she comes back from the Golden Hand, she encounters Amelie, and it's Amelie who tells her, "We need celebrations like this in the winter to remind us that spring is coming. Like, we're all, and we're all going to have the chance to live again." And so this is obviously daily life and also the idea of spiritual life. So I think that it's really important that all of these characters, they really believe that, obviously. They really believe that, and they have to believe it both in the long-term sense, but also in the sense that in their own lives they can be. Father Thomas also expresses it during the confession. I mean, um, Johann will confess to him having repeatedly slept with his dead brother's widow, and Father Thomas says, like, look, man, like, yes, Christ is infinitely forgiving, but you have to actually want to change.
Just be Anglican. It's like, man, that's an option.
He's like, you have to actually, like, yes, you have to really understand that, like, he is infinitely forgiving. We can all fail over and over again, but you have to try. You have to actually make an effort. And yes, Christ will always be there for you when you fall, but you have to stand up and try again. You can't just like endlessly slide and think that it's going to be okay. Like, you got to put some effort into it. But so all these people believe this, and yes, like, even for Andreas, having gone through everything that he has, at the end, he does come back to the world of the living. And I wanted to leave it open. Like, where does he go, given that he lost so much and his place in the world is so really truly unique. But no, but he's there and he's with these people and they say, the Muellers say like, you're always welcome here. This is your home as well.
No. All right, so that's a perfect place to kind of stop talking about Pentiment. As much as I think we could go on, I do want to respect your time. So I'll ask a couple, softy questions. I don't know if this is a softy actually. If you could make another historical game, if the opportunity came to you, do you have a time or a theme that you would want to work with?
There's a couple that I've thought of, not necessarily even in the exact same style of game, but just periods of history that I find interesting. Weimar Germany, I think, is extremely interesting. Um, for a lot of reasons. I think that, especially in the last few years, a lot of people have talked about Nazis and the rise of Nazism. And one of the more frustrating things that is that people they get it wrong. Like they misremember or they learned weird things about like Hitler was elected, and I'm like, no, he was appointed by Hindenburg, and like there was a very complex series of things that occurred, and like everything that happened after the end of World War One and the rise of paramilitary groups, not just among the Nazis but among many political parties. Like it's very, very interesting. It's very fascinating. I speak German fluently, not natively, but like I watched a lot of Babylon Berlin, which is set during the Weimar and illuminates a lot of that stuff. And I was like, man, this would be like a really interesting place to explore. To one, it's just fascinating, and two, I do think people could serve to be educated about what was going on in that time period. Um, and then the other is post Civil War Chicago,
Ooh.
which exploded in growth after the end of the Civil War, and there was a huge influx of especially freed slaves coming north, and that city grew in just unbelievable ways. Like all the stuff about reversing the flow of the Chicago River and elevating the entire city multiple feet is crazy. Everything leading up to the World's Fair, or the exposition sort of it's just incredible. So I think that post Civil War Chicago would be it's underexplored. It's a city that I'm fairly familiar with because I grew up in southern Wisconsin and my father did a lot of sculpting work in Chicago. Um, so I think that would be really, really interesting to sort of see, and especially again because I think seeing the failures of Reconstruction and how after Lincoln's assassination it all kind of fell apart for everybody, I think would be very interesting.
Nice. And you make games. What have you been playing lately that brought you joy?
I just started, so I started the Cyberpunk 2.0 patch, which I was, as a system designer, I was very happy to see all the gameplay changes they made. And then I started on Phantom Liberty, which I need to get back to, but I'm having a lot of fun with it.
Fantastic. And if people want to follow your work, your thoughts, where can you be found online?
So I'm on Twitter at JE Sawyer, although I will say I don't really post about work that much. It's kind of shit posting. And then you can find me on Tumblr at JE Sawyer. I try to answer questions there. I don't answer even half the questions I'm asked, but I do try to answer questions there as well.
Fantastic. And those of you who are out there, I can be found anywhere online as Beyond Solitaire. I'm always there. But Josh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated this interview. It was wonderful to talk about Pentiment with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, everybody out there, please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions. Most of all, happy gaming.